Thanks for sticking around, everyone. I'm Barry Tolchard. I've been, I must say, first of all, that I've just set up a 12-step program for non-12-step people, and I'm the first member of this group. I want to point out from the beginning that I'm not against 12-step programs. What I am for is consistent treatment approaches rather than sometimes the scatterbox approach that does occur. So it's great to hear protocols and schedule. You know, it's good to hear that people are standardizing things because it's the only way we're going to find out if things really work. What I'm going to talk about today is a very small study where I simply took out a sample of my previous gambling clients who were from rural backgrounds to try and determine whether there were differences in, first of all, their presentation, and secondly, in their response to treatment. Now, we do, in this service that I'm describing, we use this method we call narrow bandwidth, high dosage treatment. So we do as few approaches as possible, but we do a lot of it. And in our case, we tended to focus on either exposure therapy only with gamblers, or cognitive restructuring only with gamblers, or the combination type CBT, whichever we felt was agreeable in terms of the formulation, the individual formulation for each client. So it is an individually formulated CBT model that sticks to the cognitive model and doesn't deviate from that. Yep. So this is a very, very high dosage, narrow bandwidth approach. Now, just to give you a view, we're talking about people from the state of South Australia in Australia, which, as you can see, is significantly larger than Texas, and Texas has the population of Australia. But South Australia has a population of 1.5 million people, of which 1 million live in the city of Adelaide. Right? So you have the rest of the state with 500,000 people scattered around somewhere. When I first moved to Australia, the gambling treatment service that I established in the 1990s consisted of one therapist for the whole state, which was me. So that's what I had to deal with. Thankfully, over time, the numbers built up and we had a much broader service. But I was expected, in fact, not only to cover the whole state of South Australia, but I also expanded up into Alice Springs, if anyone knows where Alice Springs is, which is the dead centre of Australia. And I also used to go into the western part of Victoria, which is on the state next to South Australia. So it was actually an area probably as large as California and Texas combined, I would have thought. So the challenges were, how do we treat the rural gamblers? And there are plenty of rural gamblers. Gambling in Australia is the second largest industry by turnover after mining. So it's a huge industry. And unlike places like America, where America is still predominantly a casino-driven gambling environment, in Australia, you go to every pub and club, and you can go to places where there are 200 slot machines in a pub. There's Keno in a pub. There's horse racing in a pub. There's lotteries in a pub. Yeah? So you're talking about virtually, in fact, nowadays, there's poker playing in the pub. So the only thing missing from a lot of the clubs and pubs in Australia are roulette and blackjack. And then otherwise, it's a casino. So it's a high density of gambling spread across the country, with the exception of Western Australia, which doesn't allow slot machines in its public venues and only has a casino slot machine. And not surprisingly, the prevalence of problem gambling in Western Australia is fractional compared to the rest of Australia. Something like 0.2% compared to the rest of Australia's 1.5, nearly 2%. One of the things I want to point out is in the rural areas, there are 3 points of social contact in rural areas. What do you think they are? There's a church, there's a school, and there's a pub. Okay, so there are 3 points of social contact. And therefore, and I like this comment from Crocodile Dundee, if anyone remembers this, he identifies that his friend Sue has a friend who's going to see a psychiatrist for what is probably considered a first world condition. They might have had, like I was talking at lunch the other day, their car seat moved by the people who are detailing their car. And he was wondering what this was about, and he came up with this statement about in Walkabout Creek, which is essentially in Alice Springs in the centre of Australia, kind of positioning. Says, you don't have to worry about that because you just tell this one guy and he goes and tells everybody else and that's your problem solved. Right? But of course the reality try and hide their problems, to the point where I had clients who would go from a town called St Julian, which was on the far west coast of South Australia. They would come all the way to Adelaide, which was 500-600 kilometres away, rather than be seen locally. So people don't want, this is not actually what happens. People try to avoid being known to be a problem of any sort. Therefore, that does lead to this issue of the tyranny of distance that we often use in Australia, which is, how do we span that distance? There are clear urban-rural disparities. I was the gambling service for the whole of the state. For people to come and see me, they had two choices. I either spoke to them on the telephone, or they came down into Adelaide and paid huge amounts of money to come and see me for the regular sessions that were involved in this treatment. That's not unusual for mental health and addiction services generally in rural Australia. The next problem is that even if you do manage to capture someone into an urban setting for some initial treatment, once they go back to the rural setting, the follow-up and aftercare is missing, and people do relapse quite quickly. Interestingly, of course, in Australia there has been this push to have broadband networks across Australia. That therefore has increased the opportunity to do better telecommunication interventions into the rural areas. But the downside is that also means there's huge amounts of online gambling now going into the rural areas. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. We can now provide the treatment better through internet and through online services, but the gambling companies are now throwing out huge amounts of gambling at them as well at the same time. So we're not quite sure how we can kind of balance that very well. Okay, so all participants from this study, and this is why I wanted to look at this, because I wanted to initially think these were people who did have to come to Adelaide by and large. They had to come into the big city, and it cost the government a huge amount of money because the government paid for them to come in. There was they paid for the accommodation, they paid for their travel, they paid for meals while they were there. So there was a huge cost to the government, which I always felt was unnecessary. I felt that I could do something different to help people in their local setting. All therapists were masters prepared cognitive behaviour therapists, either nurses, social workers, or clinical psychologists, and there was one psychiatrist. The important thing about this is we didn't take anyone on just because they called themselves a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist. They had to be truly trained in CBT. In Australia, only 10% of clinical psychology programs are considered to have enough training in CBT to consider themselves to be cognitive behaviour therapists. America's not much better. So being a clinical psychologist alone doesn't make you a cognitive behaviour therapist. It means that you've got the potential for sure, yes, but it doesn't mean you are. This was a 2-year program. I did a 4-year CBT program, and I don't think that was enough. So I think it's important that when we talk about people providing CBT, that's what they're doing. They're not doing. I don't mind low intensity CBT, which is doing bits and bobs of CBT. That's perfectly fine. There's a place for that. But if you're talking about doing specifically CBT in its truest form, you need to know what the hell you're doing and stop putting rubbishy stuff in there that's of no relevance. And I love the thing about mindfulness, that's the new one. Stick mindfulness with everything. I don't like mindfulness, I think mindfulness has got its place as well, but it's not specifically CBT. It's something which has been added to CBT, and I think it's very good for relapse, but I don't think it's been proven as a mainline treatment yet, and I think you've got to be careful about adding stuff in before we can. But I do practice mindfulness myself when I can. Not very often, but I do try. Okay, so this is what our program was. We had an initial method. We were not an abstinence-based program. We were individually formulated CBT. The person decided what they wanted as their outcome. The majority wanted abstinence, and that's fine. And when we had people who were on a maintenance, a bit like Addie's program, we still asked for them to be abstinent for a period. We thought that was good so that they could see what abstinence was like. But they could choose then to go to maintenance abstinence. Maintenance, not maintenance, control. We refer to controlled gambling. Same sort of thing. So there was initial stimulus control. The stimulus control with gamblers, as you would expect, is money. Well, you don't have money, you can't gamble. Sort of. That's not probably true because in parts of China, people gamble with their body parts in a famous lottery where they say they'll give their kidney if and they might win $1 million yuan or whatever it is in China. Yeah? So there are some other ways in which you can gamble without money. But these are things of value. Your kidneys are a fairly valuable thing. We then used, in this order, if we were doing the mixed method, if we're doing exposure only or cognitive restructuring only, then that's obviously what we did. But if we did the mixed standard CBT model, we always did exposure therapy first with gamblers. And we always did a marginal exposure, which was we got people to imagine themselves back into the gambling venues without gambling. All of this was without gambling. So we got them to imagine themselves in the gambling venues. You imagine slot machine gamblers. You say to them, can you imagine a slot machine? And they can hear the sounds and they can see the lights before you've even finished the words. So these are fantastic people getting these images, because that's what they look at for 10 hours a day. Now, you know, if you look at a computer game, the same thing happens. You can see it in their head. It's very easy. So it was a very easy model to use. So we did live exposure after that, where people went back into venues, and it was typical exposure. It was gradual, it was prolonged, it was graded, and people didn't do anything to distract themselves from the emotion. People had to feel the emotion. In terms of gambling, it's a craving, it's a sense of wanting, or whatever the emotion might be. As with anxiety, it's the anxiety itself. So people had to feel the emotion. They didn't do anything to bring that emotion down deliberately. The exposure was designed to do that job. Once exposure had been implemented for a few sessions, again, it's individually focused, cognitive restructuring would be used as an adjunct to exposure. It was used as a means to help maintain the exposure gains. Yeah? It wasn't in itself necessarily the sole therapeutic approach that was being taken. And then we had the standard kind of CBT relapse based on the model and go type stuff that is often used. So that was the basic, and it was manualized. We had a therapist manual, had a client manual. Ooh. We used these tools. We used the South gambling screen, which is now largely a defunct gambling screening tool. But because the majority of these clients started with this, we have finished with this. We now use the Victorian gambling screen. And there's no surprise about this one, because I was part of the group who designed that screen. So, of course, it is the best gambling screen in the world if you all want to use it. The reality is that the majority of gambling services use the Canadian problem gambling screen. They're both seen as equally as good as each other. But I would naturally promote the Victorian gambling screen. Fantastic. The problem with the South Oaks gambling screen was 12 of its questions were based on debt issues. So to get a score of probable pathological gambling on the SOG screen, you only had to be indebted to a couple of places, and you got the score. So it was really kind of, if you were in debt at all, you tended to be considered a problem gambler, whether you really were or not. So it's kind of a bit of an issue. The other skills you can see are fairly standard. We use the Beck anxiety, the Beck depression, and what's called the work and social adjustment scale. This is a measure of impairment in those areas of your life due to your problem. Then we had a simple statement of where people identified quite specifically what their own problem was, and they created the statement, and we simply measured that statement. So they would say, I have a problem with slot machine gambling, it affects me. So they would create a statement, and we would then score it at the beginning of treatment, and then we'd keep scoring it throughout treatment. Part of the individualized CBT approach. Now, the rural gamblers, this is a small sample. I'm not putting numbers up very often because sometimes I had quite big numbers for the assessment data, but the data that I'm using is only those people who had all of the follow-up data, even though some people may have had the last follow-up data but didn't have the middle two. So I know that a whole bunch more probably did okay, but I didn't want to include them in this study. I wanted only those with all data points. The numbers worked out to be around, I used to see about 200 new gamblers a year. By the time this data came around, it was probably around the 2,000 gamblers were included in the data set, of which maybe 10% were rural gamblers. So not a huge number, but we're talking about a population where it has a small rural population to start. Rural gamblers tend to have great numbers of females in the sample, tend to be younger, and interestingly tend to play less on slot machines. And this confused the hell out of me because I was thinking, what else is there in the rural setting apart from the slot machine and the pub? But they were playing bingo, they were playing Keno. Keno is a nasty game. Has anyone here played Keno? It's like an electronic bingo, isn't it? These balls just pop up and you can bet anywhere from 2 numbers to 10 numbers, I think, is a traditional game. But it rotates, it constantly plays every couple of minutes.
And it's at a bar.
It's at a bar, and it's just at the bar, and you can be drinking, and this thing's ticking away. You know? And you can bet thousands of times in a session that you make at the bar. You might be out for a meal or whatever. So it's quite a nasty game, and it's probably as bad as slot machines to a certain extent. You get them in casinos. So they were predominantly playing those sorts of games, and also, as you expect in rural areas, they were playing a lot of illegal gambling, a lot of illegal card playing, and there was the famous Australian game of Tour. Has anyone heard of that? You throw 2 coins in the air and you guess what's going to come down. It's not a very complicated game at all, but people play it a lot. There were equal number of rural gamblers who failed to complete treatment compared to the urban gamblers, so there was no issue about greater dropouts from treatment. We measured dropouts in 2 ways. There were people who were assessed and then never got coming back because of the dropout from assessment, so they never got any treatment. So we considered someone a dropout from treatment as long as they'd had more than 2 sessions of active therapy. Then we would consider that a dropout from treatment. What's that one saying? Okay, so rural gamblers were more likely than urban gamblers to actually, more likely than urban gamblers to continue in the follow-up phase. So we had a program which normally would go about 12 weeks. It went as low as 1 day. I did many single-session treatment sessions, but maybe up to 12 weeks of only one weekly hourly sessions. That was as much as we ever did. And then we would follow people up 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, and we just keep following people up. So they were never really discharged because we constantly wanted to keep a track and see how their recovery was doing. There was no difference in terms of their gambling severity, but rural gamblers did tend to gamble for more hours than urban gamblers. And that might reflect the fact that the pub was it. So they would sit there and they would gamble for longer, whereas people in the urban areas might find other things to do, but still gamble pretty heavily. Now, in terms of the results, disability measured by the Work and Social Adjustment Scale, you can see that the results, while they were non-significant, the interesting point for me was that the rural gamblers in red tended to respond much quicker, and they do this across the board in all the measures. In the active treatment phase, they tended to respond more rapidly than the urban gamblers, but then in follow-up kind of got back together again. And that's something I found unusual. I was expecting a slower response and then them to catch up rather than the other way around. So I was surprised at that. In terms of anxiety, again, you can see a very, well, in this case it's quite a similar response, but a huge drop in anxiety. Urban female gamblers presented with much higher rates of anxiety than any other gambler in the service. Rural female gamblers. And rural male gamblers, high levels of depression. And they were significantly different from everybody else. So rural male gamblers were significantly different from rural female gamblers on depression, but rural male gamblers were similar to all urban gamblers on depression. So there was a rural difference. And that was quite significant. Same with anxiety and depression. Both ways it was the same. The rural gamblers differed from each other in terms of gender, but not those who were different in the rural area didn't differ from the urban side. If you get what I'm saying. Yeah. Depression, that was a bit closer, similar to. But what you do see here is, on all 3 measures, there is rapid reduction that's maintained over quite. This goes up to 3 months, but there is data with smaller samples again that goes on to 1 year and so on to 2 years and so on to 5 years. Those gains do maintain. People stay, have the quick reduction, and that reduction stabilizes quite quickly, for quite a long time. And again, remember, we're not talking about abstinence-based model here, so there's both control gamblers and abstinence gamblers in this sample. We control success based on their self-report measure of their own problem that they began at the start of treatment. I have a problem with blah, blah, blah. if they measured it at 8, if at the end of treatment they were only measured it at 2, but they were still gambling, they still felt that they had a really good improvement, and they were happy with that. And that to us was improvement. It didn't have to be absolute. I think there is an issue that we have to. I'm nearly finished. I must be well in time, I think. I rant on every conference I go to about the issue about CBT number. I equally rant on about people doing exposure properly. I was reminded by Cynthia at the back there that Dr. Phil or Dr. Bob or Dr. whoever it was, one of the TV doctors here in America, Dr. Oz, tried to do exposure with a client on TV, and he completely messed up the exposure principles. You know, and then you wonder why people have a negative thought of some of these problems. So yeah, so you've got to do it right.
He did, and I'll tell you the only thing he did wrong. He had the therapist design the exposure treatment versus the client. So it was someone's view of what would be the hierarchy of tempo, which is completely wrong. Yeah. Completely wrong, and I really, someone should write into that.
Anyway, that's another story. I'll rant on about exposure again at another conference. I do have this problem about some people call themselves cognitive behaviour therapists after a one-day workshop, and that's not uncommon. Again, I've already argued about this, but that's the fidelity. Stick to the fidelity of the program, and I think you'll probably do all right. Whichever program you've got. You know, whatever you're doing, be standardised and stick to the fidelity of your program. I think you'll always come out much better if you do that. You can see here in terms of rural outreach, use of these particular techniques. I went through a number of areas, including gambling, anxiety, and various other things. And it's interesting, I put behavioural activation in there. I'm very interested in seeing how well behavioural activation works with gamblers, because I think what you can do with behavioural activation is people do respond to those negative emotional states, and people therefore tend to gamble. But if you can use activation for them to go and do something else, I think that's probably not a bad thing. But there's nothing written about it yet, particularly. There's a few bits and bobs, but nothing seriously written about that. And I think that's the next area of gambling outcome research we should be looking at, is behavioural activation. The issue here is, when I went through very quickly, this is just me doing a quick search on the search engines to see how many times these methods are used in an outreach or an external range of rural communities. Cognitive restructuring is so rarely done that way because I think maybe therapists make it too complicated and therefore find it really difficult to get the expression across the rural, you know, through telephones or videos or online, or whether no one's just trying it. But I couldn't really find any specific non-face-to-face therapy-based cognitive restructuring rural interventions using cognitive restructuring. But there were with behavioural activation and exposure. There's a lot of online behavioural activation and exposure approaches that can be used, not just with gambling, but across the board. The reality is that the principles are always the same, whether it's a gambler, you know, certain principles don't change. You know, you adapt them and apply them accordingly to the specific conditions, but the core principles remain. We need a lot more rural evidence, and that's what hopefully that we're talking about today. So just in conclusion, rural gamblers seeking treatment tend to be female. That's not unusual. Females tend to seek treatment more than males. We've got to find a way to get the blokes, the men in there more. They do tend to be younger. I said likely, I should have said unlikely to play slot machines, so not likely. Presented with higher severity and psychological stress, but then when the treatment was over, they kind of came back together. Generally speaking, males were more at risk, though. The problem is here that rurality has certain protective factors, but the issue about this is, and I've mentioned this to some people before, once someone develops a problem, they're not helped by those protective factors, and then people get chronic problems much more quickly because they can't get the help quickly. So if you're kind of protected, but if you develop a problem, then you're kind of screwed because there's nowhere to go, usually. And that's what I think we need to figure out. And that's it. I think that's about it. So that's my main take-home message is, we know that people with rural areas develop problems less often, but the ones that develop them are usually more severe, and therefore we need to find ways in which to get into rural areas to help people more effectively. That's not dragging people like I used to into a big city, and it is somehow finding a way in which I think the model is the one like the improving access to psychological therapy model in the UK, which is doing brief intervention stuff like you were talking about, where anyone can do it. You train them up to a certain level, and anyone should be able to do it at the beginning point, and then you step people up accordingly, depending on how severe the problem is. And I think that's probably the right way to go with most of these problems, is try and get in as early as possible with reasonably well-trained people, but not super well-trained people, and then build up from there. And I think we'll probably find that a great deal of improvement. That's it.